welcome back to another of EmberWrite's Craft Chats. Today we are going to be talking about braving story structure. I'm Micah McGuire, co-founder and community lead for EmberWrite, and I am joined by award-winning author Kevin Ikenberry. Kevin's head has been in the clouds since he was old enough to read. Ask him and he'll tell you that he still wants to be an astronaut. He is the international best-selling author of the Protocol War series, featuring Colorado Book Award finalist Sleeper Protocol, which Publishers Weekly called an emotionally powerful debut, and the sequel, Vendetta Protocol. Kevin is also the author of 9 best-selling Peacemaker novels in the Four Horsemen universe, as well as the military science fiction novel Runs in the Family and the thriller Super Sync. His short fiction has appeared internationally across various publications and anthologies. A retired Army Space Operations officer, Kevin lives in Colorado with his family, and he also regularly teaches classes for aspiring writers, which is actually originally how we met, because we met at Superstars. So Kevin, it is awesome to have you on with us today. I'm super excited for this one.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
So I know this is one of your favorite topics, and this is always an interesting one to me, but I know our audience, probably half of them, heard the word story structure and started having visions of complicated, like, plotting maps and outlines and things like that. But I don't think that's necessarily what we're going for when we're talking about story structure, right? So what are we actually talking about?
We're talking about the flow of a story, right? Story has been something that's been shared verbally for thousands of years. We understand story at a very innate level. And as writers, we normally fit into one of two groups, plotters or pantsers. And plotters are the ones that have to write everything down and feel like you have, mathematical formulas swirling around your head. Pantsers are writing off the seat of their pants, trying to discover the story. The commonality between the two of them is that they both have to follow story structure. And we're not talking about a lot of plot-driven nonsense. It's basically how a story works, what grasps an audience attention, how you carry those characters in the story through to a satisfying conclusion, and how you unravel everything at the end, which is really what a story is inherently about.
Okay, so basically we're talking almost more of the, like, mechanics of a story overall, rather than the individual how you outline things like that.
Absolutely, and you can go with any number of outlines. I mean, I can think of probably 6 to 8 off of the top of my head in Western kind of style story structure. That doesn't get into Eastern style story structure at all, and you don't necessarily have to have a particular structure that you follow. A lot of times you'll see that even as you start out, you might find an initial structure that works very well for you, but you will gravitate over time to using essentially kind of an amalgamation of different story structures. It comes back to what works best for you, and that's really something that all writers have to discover. And even the discovery writer or a pantser will tell you that sometimes they're just trying to find the story. Or I can't remember who said it, but the quote was, "Pantser is basically building their first draft as an outline," I think, or something along those lines. So it's just an idea of, again, how a story fits together and the commonalities between all the different structures. That's one of the things that drives me crazy, is that just all the structures have very similar aspects, but they're named differently and they have different contexts. And when you start studying story structure, that confuses a lot of people and it makes people throw up their hands and say, I'm never going to worry about outline or structure ever again. And the reality is structure is inherent to every story. It's just a matter of how you bring that out with whatever structure you follow, or if you're just, again, discovery writing and kind of pulling it off the seat of your pants.
Okay. And what's interesting about that, because you're talking about the discovery writers here, the pantsers, that it doesn't sound like this is necessarily something that you have to have written out and mapped out before you start writing. It sounds like there is an instinctive component to this.
Absolutely. When I'm teaching classes on story structure, one of the first questions I ask a class is, how many of you have been watching a television show or a movie that you have never seen before and you know what's going to happen next? That's because we have innately been taught story over the course of our lives. So we understand major beats, we understand major action points and thematic elements. And whether we're, again, writing it down and following a plot, or we're discovering it as we go, those same beats kind of continue to come out. And sometimes we get a little bit, we get a little bit misaligned, maybe get a beat out of order or something along those lines. And those are the things that start to, compound problems, if you will. And that's where people go back and say, okay, I need to go back and relook at this in an outline format if I've never outlined before. And that can be extremely challenging. And if you're not used to outlining and you haven't studied anything about, those different mechanics, it becomes a snowball of frustration very quickly that grows and grows and grows until you throw up your hands and walk away, which is not what I want you to do.
Okay, awesome. I do want to come back to that snowball point, but quickly before there are story structures, I think that people may be familiar with, say, 7-point story structure. And then there are things that we refer to as beat structures, like Save the Cat, I think is the most famous example that most people would probably know.
Sure.
Are these referring to the same thing? Or is there a difference between a story structure and a beat structure?
In my opinion, they're the same thing. So basically what you're looking at are certain elements that have to happen at certain points. And a beat is basically, the beat is going on. You're trying to maintain the rhythm and the pacing, if you will, of a scene or of a story. And in story structure, you're moving between points so that you have your hook and you have a plot turn one and that sort of thing. So you're moving between those. So the beats that are actually happening are things that pull you a little bit more forward and focus you a little bit differently. If you look at Save the Cat's story structure versus 7-point story structure, Save the Cat, I think, is 44 beats. And Save the Cat and 7-point story structure is exactly 7. So there's obviously a lot more detail that's pulled out because of Save the Cat being focused more towards screenwriting and the like. But it breaks certain things out a little bit differently. And so the beats and those major elements of story structure, in my opinion, they're very much the same. It's just how much detail you want to go into between those points to actually pull the story out.
Gotcha. And very interesting point that you brought up that the Save the Cat is more geared towards screenwriting. Does that mean that we can still apply it if we're writing a novel or writing a short story?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you sent me when the questions were what my references are and the things that I use, and all three of them are screenwriting books. You can certainly do all kinds of different work in story structures and working with literary things, but screenwriting actually helps greatly. When I was going through the process for creating what ended up becoming my debut novel, I reached out to a mentor, and the mentor told me point blank that your book is a movie in someone else's head. So why not use screenwriting? And so I applied a lot of those elements, and my debut novel sold and had all the things that you mentioned earlier. And it's been a really fantastic ride. So screenwriting, I think, actually helps an awful lot as far as being able to not necessarily just pull those beats out, but also it's learning how to manipulate emotions. That's what we do as writers. We're manipulating emotions, how to create immersive scenes, and how to direct your characters on the screen, if you will. So there's a lot of merit to going into and studying screenwriting. I'm not saying it's the only thing that you should study. There's certainly some other things out there that I think writers need to be aware of, but screenwriting in and of itself is actually very productive for writing. There's even a version of Save the Cat now. It's Save the Cat Writes the Novel. So there's different ways to do it. It's just a matter of what works best for you again. And in this particular case, studying screenwriting because I love movies really helped me understand what I was trying to do with story and make that happen.
Okay, awesome. So moving away kind of from our context of what are we talking about when we're talking about story structure and clarifying some definitions here, and let's move into more talking about actually how do we start applying these things. I think one of the things I'm hearing for you that I do want to bring out for the audience is I am hearing very much your mileage may vary with this stuff. And I think this is very important for us to remember. And can you just give our listeners a little bit about why you feel like that's your philosophy as well?
So in middle school, most of us are taught, I use middle school because my kids have gone through this. They're taught story structure. Just the basics of story structure is basically a variation of a 19th century one called Freytag's Pyramid. And Freytag's Pyramid has the climax start and basically happen in the exact middle of the story. If you look at a movie like The Wizard of Oz, for example, that follows that pretty well, where the major battle happens at the exact middle point of the movie. And then the rest of it is this long, detailed following action, what's called the denouement, the unraveling. And so you're having to go through all these different things to make everything feel nice and wholesome and fulfilling at the end. And we skewed story structure starting in the early 20th century, looking towards a much shorter falling action at denouement because we've done so much with character building and character development over the course of the rising action to the climax. So if you look at a movie like Casablanca, for example, Casablanca does all of that. And the resolution at the end of the movie is about 3 minutes and 43 seconds, and that's it. It does everything as far as getting all those elements of story that are pulled together so that you walk out of the movie theater basically like, wow, that was great. It's super huge and fulfilling there at the end, and it didn't feel like it was dragging on and on. Because if you go back and watch The Wizard of Oz now, after the battle, and they go to see the wizard, and then Dorothy goes back to Kansas, and everything goes back to black and white. It's tedious. And so we don't need that much element of resolution and that unraveling. We want the fulfilling story at a point where we feel comfortable in walking away. And that's really what Hollywood did with story structures, skew that over in that direction so that we don't use an awful lot of falling action and resolution anymore because we don't have to.
So basically, it's a shift in the cultural way that we are applying this that is kind of the reason that maybe different story structures are going to work for different folks.
Yeah, and I think it's something that, again, talking about screenwriting and everything else, as a writer, most of us that start writing, we are still applying that story structure that we learned in middle school. And we're applying that off the 3-act structure that we learned that was Aristotle and whatnot, with beginning, middle, and end, if you will. And that's where I think a lot of us start. And I think as you get into a little bit more about writing, you have to understand and start to study structure a little bit and study how other people do it. And really, you've kind of got to develop a reference library and a toolkit, if you will, to actually go through and help yourself learn a little bit more about this, because you're going to get to a point where, yes, beginning, middle, and end, every story has one. But what makes a good beginning? How do you keep the middle from being the soggy middle, right? How do you make the end fulfilling and have it resonate with the reader? So you have to go through and you have to learn those things. So what we started with in middle school is a great foundation, but it's not the total answer.
Okay, so basically it's starting to feel out which structures are right for you, which kind of leads me into my next question. Because I know with my personal experience, I tried Save the Cat. Save the Cat did not work with my brain. Mm-hmm. I have tried Hero's Journey. Hero's Journey I cannot make work with my brain. I think your book actually is the first time that I've looked at Hero's Journey and gone, I might actually be able to pull this off now. But I know the first story structure that really resonated for me was that 7-point story structure. Because I'm sitting there going, oh, okay, this makes sense and I can make this work. So I think going into the actual question with that is, what do you think is the easiest story structure for somebody to get started with if they want to start studying this?
So again, basing off of what we learned as far as being kids and learning essentially Freytag's pyramid, you can start with that, but you're going to quickly see that there's more focus nowadays on the introduction and that rising action and the character development. So I think that looking at a simple 7-point story structure is an easy way to start. Then you could look at other story structures that are kind of similar to it, like the snowflake method has a couple of different things that you could actually use that are a little bit easier to follow. And it really comes back to, again, what you want to do and how you want to tell the story. And if you're really focused on plot driven, you're probably going to look at a 7-point story structure initially, because 7 points designed to pace you through the plot. It moves you from place to place, point to point, does those things. But you may start to look at what my characters are doing. How are my characters developing? What are they coming into the story as? What are they developing into? So you might start to look at something like Hollywood Formula, or you might start to look at something like the structure that's taught in My Story Could Be Your Story by Jeffrey Allen Schechter, which is, I think it's 36 beats. So it's a little bit different than Save the Cat, but it's the same sort of thing where it's pulling out those character dynamics and helping you understand how characters are changing over time and how the plot impacts those changes and how everything moves forward and how the characters are reacting to the universe.
Okay, that is super interesting, because I know whenever we talked to Michael Morton about villain and protagonist alchemy and how you make this work, he was talking a lot about how those yes-no reversals basically affect character development and things like that, and that is from Schechter. Mm-hmm. I am curious, do certain story structures kind of skew you more towards a character-driven story versus a plot-driven story? Because I do feel like that's another place where writers tend to fall into two camps.
I think that every story that we tell, it basically comes down to a character-driven story. We start with plot because that's what we were taught. Again, going back to school, we're taught Freytag's pyramid. Freytag talked about 5 plot points, and it's all framed through the 3-act structure that Aristotle taught us. So we're focused on these plot events, that we have to do these things. We have to make sure that these things happen in order, that sort of thing. And what we miss is the character. We miss how a character is created, how they start in the story, how they end at the end of the story, what trials and tribulations they have to go through. And I think when you start looking at structure from a perspective of how your characters are reacting to that plot, it's kind of an amalgamation between the two, if you will, between character and plot driven. But I don't think plot driven is as much as we need to make of it anymore. I think we've been kind of conditioned to expect that we need to think about plot, when really we need to think about the characters and the overall story, if you will.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess I'm curious, because I think in my mind, these things have always run along closely connected parallel tracks. You kind of have your character arc versus you have your plot arc, and, obviously things kind of interact and cross. how do you ensure that basically you have those things tracking along side by side? Is it just the nature of the story structure you're using, or is there some kind of like special, extra stuff that you need to do whenever considering these story structures?
The big one is character goals. Your characters have to have something to do, and your character has goals at the start of the story that are going to be very different than what happens as the story unfolds around them. One of the examples I actually use is the first Star Wars movie, Luke Skywalker. When we meet Luke Skywalker's a whiny teenager. He wants to leave the farm. He wants to go to the flight academy with his friends. Those are his goals. And we start to learn that the flight academy is run by the Empire. That's probably not a good thing, right? And so as Luke begins to lose his innocence, if you will, as the story evolves around him, his worldview starts to change. So then his goals after he meets R2D2, his goal is that he needs to rescue Princess Leia. And then he needs to save Leia later on by defeating the Death Star. And then he also says at a later point that he wants to become a Jedi like his father. So from the moment we meet Luke to the point where at the end of the movie, Luke's goals have changed completely because of the plot and the storyline that he's been involved with. So they are parallel tracks, but I don't think I don't think they stay parallel. I think they're intertwined like a helix, because as something is happening with the plot, it's happening to your character. Because when things happen to us in real life, we make changes. We make different reactions. And today's reaction will be different than tomorrow's reaction. So our characters are reacting to those events around them. And that's really what spurs the story forward, is not just the character that we've created, the whiny teenager, but how does the whiny teenager become the hero of the rebellion? And what changes need to take place for that to actually be believable for us? Because if it's not believable, there's a point probably in the theater where we've all walked out, because we can't imagine this whiny farm boy climbing into an X-Wing fighter and destroying the Death Star. Luke has to change over time, and our characters have to change. Harry Potter, Harry is always brave and valiant, but there's a moment where he has to stand up and say enough. And that's what we want to see, because we want to have that effective, if you will, we call it a mirror effect is one way to look at it, is we want to see ourselves in the character. And we want to see that the character finally says, I've had enough and I can stand up and do this. And that affects us as well, because we all go through things in life where we get to that point where we want to be able to stand up and say, I'm done. And I want to, proceed heroically, if you will. So I think the two are fully entwined as they go through the process, because if it's just plot, your character never changes. And they're constantly reacting to the situation around them. Think about the Transformers movies, for example, any type of those big blockbusters. The characters are all the same. Nothing ever really changes to really make them think about what's actually happening around them. So as something happens, if another character dies, that needs to be a very significant moment to the rest of the cast. And if it's not, then you've got this, I'm just going through the plot, I'm going through the motions with big explosions or whatever else, and I'm not really getting to what's actually affecting the story at the emotional level, which is what you want to be at.
Right. And I am going to kind of ask a question that is off on a little bit of a tangent, but this has been one that, as I've heard more folks talk about these character goals and things like that, I am super curious about. Because part of story structure is writing a story that is going to sell, ultimately, in my mind. Mm-hmm. If you are going to pitch a character that has these changing goals, what goal actually needs to go in the pitch?
So typically, if you look at goals, I've always been taught that there's 3 levels of goal. You have your professional goal, you have a personal goal, and you have a private goal or a spiritual goal. So the professional goal is the largest one in the story, right? In Star Wars, it's destroy the Death Star. And we learn about destroy the Death Star from the crawl at the very beginning, where the text comes up and the music's playing and we read about what's happening in this universe. That's the first place where we learn about the Death Star. So Luke Skywalker doesn't learn about the Death Star till he actually sees it. That's the big change for there. So Luke is actually moved on. The goal that changes him is he thinks he needs to rescue Princess Leia. So the personal goal is kind of the goal that is the motivation for the character, and it's how they recruit friends, if you will. So if you think about Luke Skywalker recruiting Han Solo and Chewbacca, there's a moment where the sole thing that Luke says is, she's rich, which applies to the fact that Han is broke and he needs to repay Jabba the Hutt and everything else. So we've learned of, Han Solo's character. We've learned the things that he's dealing with, and his goal is to pay off Jabba the Hutt. Well, this now accomplishes a way for him to pay back Jabba the Hutt and accomplish his goal while helping Luke and the major goal of the story. So when you're looking at goals that actually move things forward, most of the time is the personal goal that is the one that's shared in the pitch. And depending upon what you're doing, Like if you think about the crawl again at the beginning of Star Wars, that's the back cover copy book of the movie right there. That's telling you what's happening in the movie. That's the whole plot of the movie. And so there you get the idea of, okay, that's what they're trying to do, and here's the character that's going to do that and what that character wants to do.
Okay, perfect. That does help a ton. Just because, again, I think whenever we start talking about multiple goals and things like that, I think that has clicked for me because I've always struggled because I think I connect to the personal goal first and then I end up coming up with the professional goal over time. And it's always been a struggle for me to pitch because I go, well, I mean, the main goal of the story is here, but if the personal goal is here, how do we manage that?
Right. And I think one of the things that you can do, there's a trick to that too. One of the things that you can do is if you answer all three levels of those goals, right, the professional, the personal, and the private, you actually then have essentially a log line or a central question for your story. Will Luke Skywalker destroy the Death Star, rescue Princess Leia, and become a Jedi Knight like his father? That is essentially the log line of the entire Star Wars original trilogy.
Right. So you can actually use those goals to almost build your elevator pitch.
Exactly.
Okay. Fantastic. And I think that's a really good answer to, how these goals tie in together is that we need to think about it as the plot is going to have an impact on the character that's then going to change their goals, that's then going to have an impact on the plot. So I think folks, I'm thinking about it as kind of a DNA thing almost.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned that the helix, if you will. That's essentially what it is. The story, the DNA of a story is the plot, the characters, the setting, all that stuff being wound together. And so that as the story is progressing forward, we're going through it with the characters and we're experiencing the same changes and the same things that they're seeing.
Are there certain methods that just may not work with a certain type of brain? Basically, you have certain methods that are going to click better than others, or are they all so similar enough that basically once you get the hang of one, you're going to be able to get the hang of the others? Kind of like learning a new language is what I think of it as.
I think what the way that I would approach that is if you start reading about a story structure, right? Let's say you look at the 7-point story structure and you start reading about it on online articles, or you go back and you watch the Dan Wells videos from several years ago that actually talk through the different 7 points. Then if that's not clicking for you, but you're still wondering what's happening, then I would go and pick up another reference and start to look at, okay, what actually are we talking about here? Because most of the time what's happening is there's something contextually that we don't get about a particular structure. So if you start talking about Save the Cat, for example, when you get into Save the Cat, you come up to a point in the second act where it's one step forward, two steps back. Well, what's that really mean? Right? How do I actually address that? If you look at then the My Story Can Beat Up Your Story by Schechter, he breaks that down into those yes-no cycles. And those yes-no cycles are then broken down a little bit more as far as, in this particular point, this is around what we're looking for. So I think by taking into different references and different contexts, it helps us figure out where our I won't say our shortcomings are, but where we short circuit when we're thinking about story structure. Because now I don't use one particular story structure when I'm actually writing and I'm building a project. I've got this hideous amalgamation of things that I know that works well for me because I've studied this and I've gone through this over and over and over again. So now I understand when I'm laying out the original bare bones of a story, I do it in 7-point story structure. But then when I'm looking at the emotional development of a character over time, I'm doing a lot more with My Story Can Beat Up Your Story, but I'm also sprinkling in some Save the Cat and I'm sprinkling in some hero's journey because there's certain things that happen at certain points that you really need to capitalize on to move the story forward. So it becomes something that we have to, again, you never stop learning as a writer. Everybody thinks that I just sit down and I just type, and it's not. You have books that you're always going back to, things that you're pulling up if you have problems, and some of those can be old, dry textbook kind of things. Some of those can be the newest, hottest article online. It doesn't matter. As long as you're reading and learning and understanding different things, you start to see where your short circuits come from, and you're able to address them a little bit easier.
Yeah. And I think that actually brings up several points for me when you've discussed that, is that, first of all, it sounds like story structure has these multiple layers. And I think what may happen to some newer writers, especially, or newer to story structure, is that they're trying to tackle all the layers at once. And that's kind of, short-circuiting them to a certain extent.
Right. Well, if you look at, so let's take 7-point story structure, right? The hook. The hook is all about introducing the characters and what they want. And essentially, that's most of Act 1. So if you're trying to do all of that as quickly as possible, if you're writing a 100,000-word book, Act 1 is going to be probably between 20 and 25,000 words. You have a lot of space in there to introduce these characters and what they want. So you don't have to do it right up front with, hi, I'm John, and this is what I want to do. You have the opportunity to tell that in a little bit more of a story aspect and start kind of peeling back the layers of the onion, if you will. So it's understanding the amount of time and the word count that you have to play with as well. Because if I'm doing a short story that's 10,000 words and I want to try to do 7-point story structure, I'm looking at 1,100 words. That's about the time frame I have to introduce the character, what they want, and what the situation is. So it's very tight on a timeline perspective, and so you have to understand what your constraints are in those perspectives. But then again, as you go back and look, you don't have to do everything right off the bat. You can tell us a little bit more about this Luke Skywalker character, right? Tell me a little bit more about Harry Potter. Tell me a little bit more about Katniss Everdeen. Katniss Everdeen, we get a lot of exposition on Katniss in the Hunger Games before we actually get to that point where the vote happens and then she takes Prim's place. So there's a whole lot that you can actually do in those places, but it's showing the character as much as you can in their normal world, like Hero's Journey talks about, and then when they step into that special world, how does that transform them? How does that change them?
Right. And I think another thing that you brought up that I'm connecting back to one of our previous episodes is J.T. Evans talked about with outlining, that if a certain outlining method isn't working for you, A, first of all, that's not your fault. B, it's not a failure of you with that. It's more of the process failed you, not you failed the process. But C, also to take elements of what is working and what's not. And it sounds like, once you get to a certain comfort level with story structure, that's really where we ultimately end up, is we take, a little bit from 7-point, a little bit from Hero's Journey, and we kind of smash all of these things together until we get something that's working with our brain. And is that about accurate?
Absolutely. Like I said before, it's context. So if you look at major story structures, side by side, Hero's Journey and 7-point story structure, Hero's Journey calls the hook something different. In 7-point story structure, plot turn 1 is the culmination of everything that's happened in the hook. That's the call to adventure in Hero's Journey. Same thing, same point in the story, same critical beat, 2 different names and 2 different definitions. And that is prevalent through every story structure that you side by side compare with anything. They're all the same at their critical beats. And as we go through and we read articles, or we go through and we attend classes or whatever, we're going to have those moments where the brain is, again, it's kind of short circuiting. Look, I don't get this. You're telling me about this thing, but I've been reading about this thing. And it's a matter then of, can you connect the 2 together? Once you understand the context is different, but it's the same actual place in a lot of cases, it enables you to get your mind wrapped around that context a little bit better and make it something that you can actually then create the story structure that works for you.
It's really funny that you say that, and I am going to go ahead and do a mini pitch for your Mercenary Guide to Story Structure, because I think that is something that I kind of had that aha moment myself, because as I said, Hero's Journey has never really clicked for me. 7 points clicked great. Like, that was the first one that was like, oh, okay, I get this. And whenever I was reading Mercenary Guide to Story Structure and you did that breakdown of how these points match up, I went, oh, wait, no, I think I finally get it. So I think that's a really great example of that kind of context setting. So folks, if you need a primer on how a lot of these story structures interconnect and intertwine and how they map to different story structures, definitely give Kevin's book a read there. But along with that, obviously outside of going and purchasing that one, which I recommend everyone should do, but if we're going to learn about these story structures, kind of what is your recommendation? Is this something that, it's easiest to start off with articles first and then dive deeper? Or do we need to go to like the original source material? Like, if you're trying to get a feel for a new story structure, what would be the curriculum that you would suggest, for lack of a better term?
So the thing about the way that social media works now, there's tons of articles that appear almost daily from different websites and whatnot, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. I'll be honest. So you can certainly start there and look at certain things, but anytime I look at an article online and it references a source document, that's the first place I go, is what's that source document, and that way I can go back and take a look at it. So, like, for example, when we talk about the Hero's Journey was converted to the Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler back, I think, in the 70s. It's been a long time. But Vogler's original creation for this was an article in a magazine. And so I actually found this the other day cleaning out my closet, but I had that article in print because I wanted to make sure that I had that. So when you look at something, as far as starting a curriculum, there's a ton of good works out there, a ton of different books. If you're interested in Save the Cat, you pick up Save the Cat and you read it. And if you get that red flag moment, that's when you stop and maybe you look at something different. If you go to the reference section at Barnes & Noble, there's probably 10 or 15 books on story structure, plotting, that sort of thing. Any number of those would be a place to start. But it's recognizing that that's just one reference. And there are thousands of them, and you have to kind of figure out what works for you. The other thing that writers need to do is talk to each other. We talk about the importance of networking. Understanding how other writers work together or how their processes work is very different. I got into an argument one time on a video conference presentation during the COVID year that I was on with another writer, and this other writer was like, "My outline is written in concrete. Once I write my outline, nothing changes." And I said, "Mine's written in Jello." I give my characters the opportunity to go and do things and to kind of explore the universe, if you will. So understanding how different people work and how different people approach different things. If you sat down at a table full of writers and ask how everybody visualizes their story, everybody's going to be different. Nobody's going to have the same answer to everything, especially the more experienced writers that you have. They're not going to necessarily sit down and say, "Well, I follow this story structure beat by beat." It's not the way it works. So it's learning a little bit from each other and then diving into references. And if you find something that actually resonates with you, buy a copy and keep it on your desk. That's what you do.
Yeah, it's actually really funny because I was telling my fiance that the more I hear from all of these experts and published authors, the more I'm realizing it's kind of like that meme with the bell curve where there's no rules. I must follow this story structure perfectly versus there are no rules.
Yeah.
But that's a really good point about talking to other writers. And I think the point, folks, that I do want to emphasize here is there's not one right way to do it. If you've listened to any of our other podcasts, you have heard this from pretty much everybody. It is not something that you have to follow each of these as some kind of holy text. There are going to be things that are recommended and probably will save you a lot of time in the long term and a lot of grief with your writing. But it is ultimately not something that you have to follow things perfectly. Use what works for you and discard what doesn't.
Yeah, there's a whole lot to be said for long-term problems. And, there's the same things that we've thought about as far as stories as writers and whatnot. We have ideas that may not be working and we haven't figured out what actually works. One of my favorite stories, I was teaching my story structure class in Pueblo, Colorado, and I had in the library, I've got a room full of people and I'm teaching. All of a sudden in the back of the room, and it's kind of dark lit, but in the back of the room, I hear this woman basically scream and she's got her hands on her head. And I'm thinking, did she get bit by something or is this a medical emergency? And I said, "Is everything okay?" And she goes, "You just solved a problem that I've been struggling with for 10 years. So,
I love those moments.
When you start talking to people and you start reading other things, you may have a book that you keep on your shelf for one chapter or one paragraph that really resonated with you, and you go back to it over and over again. That's how it works. You have to use what resonates with you, because if you understand it, that's one thing. But if you understand it and have that resonance that you can then take it and apply it, that's the gold medal. That's what you take forward and use as a writer.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm thinking about this now, and I'm thinking about I probably need to open up an EmberWrite project and have just a dump of all of the stuff that resonates with me, just so I can keep it on hand and reference it back and forth. Because I always forget these lessons, it feels like. I come back to the same problems over and over and go, "Oh, wait, no, I've already solved this once."
Yeah, I think that the smartest thing I ever did was I got a little bookshelf for the side of my desk. It's just off camera here to my left. And that's where my writing books are. And the ones that resonate with me have a place there. And I pull them out if I need to, because if I see them, it's not that I think, it's my crutch or anything. It's there if I need to go back and pull it out because I'm struggling with something, or if something doesn't work. Usually I can go back and I can open up the chapter to where I think is not working, and I can read about it and then go, "Oh, okay, now I can proceed with this." So yeah, having that resource library is huge.
Yeah, and another thing I also want to emphasize here is that even highly successful authors struggle with this stuff. It is not always just going to be something simple, because we have this pressure that we feel like if it's not coming to us easily, we're not doing something right, and there's some kind of magic spell or some kind of magic story structure that we missed somewhere. But I think it's very important to emphasize, guys, like it's a craft and we're always learning.
And I think another part of that too, and this is going to deviate from story structure a little bit, but you leverage each other's opportunities and experiences in the real world too. Your career fields matter a lot when you start talking with other people about different things. I've been brought in to be a military consultant on some projects, just because of the fact that I served in the military for over 20
Yep.
years and I have that knowledge base, and I'm willing to share about that. So I have a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist, and I have pinged him on occasion, be like, hey, I've got this problem. How does this work? So being able to leverage what each other actually do in the real world besides writing is also a huge talent to pull from too.
Yeah, and it all comes back to that community support as well. Pulling more back to story structure, do you have advice for folks that are worried about using story structure because they're worried their work's going to end up coming across as formulaic?
So here's the thing about formula. This goes back to my comment earlier about, have you ever watched a television show or a movie that you haven't seen before and you know what's going to happen next? Formula is okay. Formula makes a lot of people, in television in particular, very rich. So formula can be okay. But what you start seeing, and the ways that story structure is applied a little bit differently, is the way that you get to a reveal, if you will, in those areas is always done a little bit differently. Or you see something that is done way out of whack that actually works. Like, for example, the ending of The Sixth Sense, the M. Night Shyamalan movie with Bruce Willis. There's a huge twist at the end. I'm not going to spoil it, but because the way that everything has been portrayed to that point, you never see it coming because it's portrayed straightforward. And then all of a sudden, this is introduced to you in a very different way, and you realize everything that you have seen, while straightforward, was incorrect. You were following the incorrect storyline. You were following the incorrect signals. You don't worry about being formulaic. You don't worry about tropes. People love tropes, the commonalities that are present in fiction, if you will. So that's all well and good. And that's the other piece of it is, well, if I tell a story with structure that I have to study, then I'm going to fall into all the same old plots and all the stories of all that have all been written and whatever else. They have. All those major plots, man versus man versus nature, man versus God, they've all been done to ad nauseum. What matters is the character. What matters is what you're creating, the universe, again, the characters, the plot that you bring in, and how all that you tie together in the story. That's what matters. So it's not necessarily the formulaic that you need to worry about. You need to write the story that sells, and that's the one where you can identify with the characters, you see the characters grow and their changes, and what happens at the end resonates with you.
Yeah. And I also think about like Kurt Vonnegut's Shape of Stories whenever we bring that up, all the different story archetypes that he found. Mm-hmm. And also like thinking of different plot points that you can play with, because I'm going to try not to spoil this here, but I am going to show how much of a nerd I am. So Expedition 33, Clair Obscur, for those of you who are into RPG gaming, has a very major twist towards the midpoint that I don't think anybody would have seen coming. And basically that's one that I think we're used to seeing those twists kind of towards the end of a story, but maybe not that soon in the story. So I think, that would be my advice too, is if you're that worried about being formulaic, think, okay, well, what would be maybe an earlier plot point or a later plot point that I can play with and move around?
And if you're starting to look at twists too, and I want to be edgy and different, a lot of the things that you come up with that are edgy and different are not going to work. There are authors who have produced books that they've done an edgy plot twist, 2/3 mark of the book, and changed the protagonist, and it doesn't work because you've set up the new protagonist before as a whiny underling to the real protagonist. Protagonist gets killed off, and this guy now is supposed to be the hero I'm supposed to follow. No, that book ends up across the room or returned to the library because I'm not going to read it, because it's too much of a twist, and I don't have the faith in the other character that's now brought in to be the hero of the story because he's been set up improperly. So you got to be cautious when you start thinking about how I'm going to do this differently, and really try to study what actually works.
Speaking of that, if we are going to go back to that snowball of frustration, so let's say we've got a writer that has started off with their story, they did not do story structure, and they've ended up with this kind of piece that they're going, I feel like I've got this great swampy middle here. It's just everything feels like it's a mess. How do you start untangling something like that? Is it even possible? Because personally, I've had a couple that I've looked at and been like, there is no way I'm going to be able to fix it. It's too tangled.
Yeah. So my book, Runs in the Family, was the first book I ever tried to write. And it took me about 18 months. And when it was finished, I thought it was amazing, but it was in reality a pretty god-awful mess. And so I pitched it to an agent, an editor actually, and the editor came back and said, your book dies in Act 2. I didn't understand why until I got a little bit deeper into understanding story structure, because I wasn't giving the villain enough to do. The villain needs to have more to do so that you can avoid that soggy middle, if you will. When the book sold to a different house, the editor came back and said, this is a great book. I love the book, but it starts in the wrong place. And so I ended up losing the first 3.5 chapters, and I lost a bunch of stuff from the middle of the book as well, because when you're producing the story, we see the story in our heads as perfect. And that's the problem. We see our story as perfect. Oh, it has to start here and it has to end here, and this is all those things. And the deeper you get into studying story structure and the more experience you have writing and completing projects, you start to see that your original intent of where you started, where you finished, doesn't have to be there. There's certain things that work well in both cases, but it's just a matter of, again, of you've got to learn a little bit more, you've got to experience a little bit more, and then work with a trusted editor, because an editor is going to tell you what works or what doesn't work. And if your story is starting in the wrong place, that's one of the first things that you realize after you have that conversation. In my particular case, I sat down with the editor at a coffee shop, and she said, hey, there's what's going on. And I looked at it and I said, well, then you'd want to start it here. And she said, yeah. And I said, okay. It made sense to me that we could actually start the story in a different place. And all that backstory I created was great stuff, but it didn't necessarily need to fit into the story. It was things that I could actually use through exposition later on and learn about the character and learn about where they came from, without having to go into their life story in the first 3 chapters. So there's a different way to do it. And part of it is just getting it seen by other people. That's really hard for new writers, to show their work to other folks that are not their parents or their brothers or sisters or their closest friend is going to say, this is the greatest thing ever. You have to kind of put things out there. You can't write in a vacuum, and it's hard to do it the first couple of times, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And then you can really start to see what other people are resonating with and what other people are just saying, this doesn't work for me. And if you get enough of those, then you need to move on from that.
Slightly getting off topic of story structure here, but I think connects back to that point. How do you go about finding those first trusted folks? Because I know personally I got very lucky. I had a local critique group that was wonderful for many, many years. And then I had an online critique partner that did a fantastic job. Now I know a lot of folks in our local area that basically I would be happy to pass work off to. How do you kind of find folks that you can actually trust? Because I do think that there are some cases where sometimes it's just not a good fit. Maybe they're not a genre reader of yours, or they're not the audience you're writing for. And some folks I do think can separate themselves from that when doing critiquing and things like that. And I would believe editors would. But how do you kind of find that trust without basically having a lot of bad experiences first?
Well, you hopefully get lucky. I mean, I was lucky as well. I started with an online writing workshop back in the early 2007, 2008 kind of time frame. And I got to know a couple of people there, and I'm still friends with all of them. One of them has won a Nebula Award. So, I got lucky in that particular case. But you're right. You've got to find the people that will read your genre, or you've got to find the people that are able to separate out the genre and focus on the technical aspects. So anybody that's done any editing or been around in that space, or can put on that headspace, if you will, that's going to help you as well. The challenge that you come into with writing groups, and I've had this happen with with groups as well, in-person critique groups, you may reach a point where you outgrow the group, and that's hard. When you start getting back things from your group where everybody hands you back the 30 pages that you gave them last month, and this is great, I didn't find anything wrong with it. There's probably you probably have outgrown the group a little bit. It's again, I think, goes back to the sense of community, getting out and meeting other writers. We talk about the importance of going to conventions and workshops. It's also, we talk about the importance of things like BarCon, right? Going and socializing and networking, because that's where you have a lot of those relationships that will really develop. And now, I have friends, I have a friend that's a literary agent. She and I have been friends for probably 10 years. She is not my agent, and she doesn't necessarily go with my genre, but because we've become friends, I've had things professionally where I've been able to reach out to her before I had an agent and say, hey, this has happened. Can you help walk me through this? And she, again, because of friendship, is like, yeah, absolutely. Here's what you do. So having those relationships and that socializing time is huge. So you've got to meet the people around you. And sometimes passing out your work for other people to read or critique is going to be a little bit of trial and error. You may have somebody that you think might be a great fit, and they're like, I don't really connect to this genre, and technically I have some different preferences, and you say thank you very much and you move on. You don't try to keep pestering that person, keep trying to squeeze blood from a turnip, if you will. You be done with it and move on to try to find another person or two. And don't be surprised that circle of readers and critique partners changes a lot over the course of your career. I think most of the people that I started writing with now are no longer either writing, or people that I haven't seen in months to years, because It's just the different ways that life has taken us. So yeah, get out and meet people.
Yeah. It sounds like we're going to also have to also do a session on finding your support group as a writer. So
Definitely, yeah. This is not a solitary journey in any way, shape, form, or fashion. You've got to have a support network.
okay, bringing things back to story structure here. I am curious, what's the most unique story structure that you've come across?
Without delving into a bunch of the different ones, Eastern story structure is pretty fascinating if you start looking at it, how Asian myths and whatnot are told in story. Those are pretty fascinating. Honestly, I think when I was really getting involved with looking at story structure, looking at a Hollywood formula, how movies like Casablanca and whatnot were made, where you started looking at 3 acts, 3 characters, sort of mentality. The story, the book by Robert McKee is one I'll bring up later on in the references because it's very much old Hollywood style. But it was something that, again, because of the change in the American consciousness during World War II, movies were either one of two things. They were either massive epics like 4 and 5 hours, like, Gone with the Wind or the Ten Commandments, or they were follies, 60 to 80-minute movies with no plot, nothing happened. It was just all about action and music and whatever else. And so when Casablanca and similar films came along, things changed. Why did that change? And that's how, again, looking into those story structures, how they did that, being able to take these, what everybody thought needed to be the massive epic and shortening them down to under 2 hours to be able to accomplish the attention span and tell a good story was pretty fascinating. And it really changed the way that human beings process story.
To think that it's just a media change and like a change in the social voice of the time. That is fascinating. So if you could go back and talk to just getting started writing, Kevin, what are the pieces of advice that you would give yourself about story structure?
When you sent me this question, I think that the first thing I thought when I saw it was, I'm very glad that I started my journey on story structure where I did, because I had written runs in the family. I'd submitted it to an editor and who had turned it down. And I had an idea for a second novel. And that was the first time I ever sat down and tried to actually outline a novel. And so I talk about it in classes, how I'd had foot surgery and I was literally on my butt for about 4 weeks. And so I thought, I'm just going to outline this story. And so I pulled up the laptop and I flipped Microsoft Word over to outline mode. And I just sat there watching the cursor blink because I didn't know how to do it. And so I reached out to that same editor and said, hey, you had taught classes on this at this writing workshop. How do I do this? And his name's Lou Anders. Lou was the editorial director at Pyre Books for a while. He's now a very successful middle grade author and game designer. And Lou actually walked me through over the course of about 6 weeks how to do this, and really focused me on character development, on making the character change along with the plot, how all that works together, and really got me to delve into story structure. And I'm very thankful that I did it as early as I did. And that's one of the things that I always try to tell new writers is, start learning now. If you've got something you identify as a gap in your learning or a gap in your knowledge, fill that gap. Start asking questions. Start going to conferences, going to workshops, and do that sort of thing. I think the thing that I would do differently is meet an in-person writing group first rather than an online writing group. But because of what I was doing at the time, I didn't have that opportunity. And where I was, there wasn't really a good writing environment as far as a crowd of people that were writing that I'm aware of. So being able to start doing things in person, I think would have been a little bit better back in those days. But I started down the story structure path very early. I'm very, very fortunate that I did.
Okay, awesome. So if we are going to talk resources on story structure, what are your top 3?
So off my writing desk here next to me, so I've mentioned this one a lot, My Story Can Beat Up Your Story by Jeffrey Allen Schechter. This is the book that Lou Anders sent me to, and it really changed the way that I write. And I attribute my success in a lot of ways to fully understanding and using the processes in that book. I mentioned it a second ago, Robert McKee's Story. Very old Hollywood, very, very heavy screenwriting book, but it's something that there's little bits of knowledge in there that you can still pull out for novel writing that are very poignant. It helps you construct a scene where the characters are reacting in a way that you can see it. And if you can see it, you can imbue that to the reader, that they can visualize what's happening in the way that you're presenting the story itself. And then Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, the screenwriting version. Again, because I can take these two, basically I can put them side by side and I can look at both of them if I need to, if I'm stuck on something, and I can figure out which one is telling me to do it from which way. And that helps me be able to unlock the story and move on in any project that I get stuck on.
Okay, perfect. And folks, I am also going to note just another one for 7-point structure. JT and I had discussed this during our outlining session, but KM Wieland has some great stuff on 7 points. So if you're interested in that one specifically, look at into her resources. So she's got some great ones.
Or search Dan Wells' 7-point story structure on YouTube, because Dan's lectures are on it. And Dan's a great guy, and he does it very well.
Yeah, perfect. Sometimes it's easier to learn by example with story structure as well. So do you have recommendations for like your top 3 pieces of media? You know, we don't have to necessarily limit it to books because we have talked screenwriting a lot. What would you say is like masterclass in story structure?
Ironically, because I write mostly science fiction and military science fiction, looking science fiction wise, Arthur C. Clarke does a lot with story structure, where you follow a particular set of beats and whatnot, especially the books like Childhood's End and Songs of the Distant Earth. So those are good classic examples in sci-fi. Honestly, thrillers are probably one of the areas where modern story structure is still done very well, and go all the way back to even some of the crime novels of the 1980s. So like Elmore Leonard, for example. Elmore Leonard was a tremendous novelist, both from the crime and the Western perspective, and he understood story structure very well. Several of his books have been made into some of my favorite movies, like Jackie Brown, for example, and Out of Sight, a couple of different others. So he's just a phenomenal understanding of story, and how that not necessarily following a rigid structure, but how you are telling the story of the characters and the plot, and how it all, again, winds together. That's usually, that's a pretty good way to do it. Modern thriller wise, really like the work of folks like Nick Thacker, Kevin Tumlinson. They've kind of taken some ideas on modern thrillers and just kind of tweaked the structure just a little bit. And it's still a masterclass on how to actually write it. There's other folks that are doing things from a structure perspective that, again, they're following the characters, they're applying the pressure at the right points, and they're seeing the character develop in real time along with the audience expectation. So, you don't get into a true formulaic book, but there's certainly the folks that are very popular that you see in mainly airport bookstores for fiction. Those folks understand structure really well, because in a lot of cases they could be almost the same book and the same plot, the same story, but they're still able to do it well because they've understood how to manipulate the structure and the characters to get you to buy the book, no matter how many of them you've read.
Okay, fabulous. I think, folks, that's going to be a great set of resources for you to look into if you are working on this stuff. And like I said, it sounds like our main points here are, first and foremost, find your writing support group with this, because it's a lot of learning from others. Second of all, go to the source code on a lot of these methods if there's one that appeals to you. And like I said, if you want a good overview, Mercenary Guide to Story Structure is a great one. Then, ultimately starting to read these things and see where these things piece together. All right, our last one. Where can our listeners find out more about your writing and your classes as well, in your books?
I'm on all the different social medias. Kevin Ikenberry, kevinikenberry.com is my website. I have a newsletter that you can sign up for there. I have a page for courses and whatnot. I don't have any courses planned for the rest of 2026. I am under deadline with about 4 different projects. So might try to do something later on in the year, but I haven't actually set anything up yet. So I'll be teaching again at the Superstars Writing Seminar in February of next year. I will be actually teaching my 3-hour masterclass in story structure, I found out. So they want me to come back and teach that.
Oh,
so
awesome.
If you want the full 3-hour version of me hammering story structure at you, then you can certainly come to that. But yeah, that's where to find me. And please find me on social media.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks a ton, Kevin. I'm sure this has been enlightening because, again, just so much interesting stuff we can dive in through on story structure.
Oh, we could have kept going for about 4 hours. So.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and we will see you at the next Craft Chat.